Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, the show focused on beer education. I'm Jonathan Thompson, Advanced Cicerone, BJCP beer judge, and fermentation enthusiast. Welcome back to the Beer Taster's Notebook, episode 25, Beer Styles. So I think just for fun, I want to veer off the sort of deep dives in biochem for the summer and really start talking about enjoying and tasting beer. And I think that what we should do first is talk about beer styles and sort of who the players are, what differentiates them, et cetera, et cetera. And so in tasting exams, we have this whole crazy style discrimination thing where you'll get a beer and then an option, let's say, of 2 styles at the lower levels and then maybe 4 styles at the higher levels, all of which are sort of around the same color. And in some cases, it's pretty easy to differentiate them. Like a Weiss beer and an IPA are going to have totally different noses, and they're going to be very, prominent. But, like a Scotch ale and a Bock, both which tend to be malt forward with some alcohol presence and not a lot of bitterness. It can be kind of tricky. So you have to find little nuances to pick out there. And by the way, in that example, the secret is fermentation character. And so let's go through all the styles like really, really briefly, like literally just feather touching on them. And then we can go through each of one of them individually, which is going to be a lot of episodes, but it'll be fun. So let's start over in jolly old England for no good reason. So the general family of styles here are going to be milds, bitters, browns, IPAs, stouts, porters, golden ales, and okay, I guess that's a lot. And then there's stronger beers like barley wines and old ales. And so let's start with the mild because it's the mildest. So it's a very malt forward beer. There's pale milds and dark milds, by the way, but the dark mild seems to be more common. So as I mentioned, they are malt focused. They're low alcohol beers, so they're very sessionable. And the key here is, of course, to be able to drink quite a few while sitting at the pub. And the bitterness is, as I mentioned, quite low. And there can be a number of different malt and yeast expressions here. I find faint sort of dark bread and some caramel tend to fit the general description pretty well, but they're not like overly sweet or cloying or anything like that. So they are quite drinkable despite the fact that the bitterness is low. Kind of a rudimentary view here is that it's like a very small porter. And that's probably a decent way to look at it at first. Again, we're not going to go too deep on these, so we can go style by style later on. And so the bitters are a family, not the kind of family who never picks up your mail unless their dog, do its business on your lawn and whatever. But like it's a family of beers. And so the bitters are kind of like a pale ale. It's funny because the American amber ale evolved from the British bitters or pale ales, and the British bitters evolved from pale ales. But if you get an American amber ale, it should be pretty aggressive. And this is almost like the bitters are almost like a Britishified amber ale. Actually, this is not making any sense. If you get an amber ale in America, it should be pretty aggressive. If you get a Canadian amber ale, you're going to have no idea what you're going to get because sometimes it's like an American amber ale. Sometimes it's more like a British beer and it's almost like an extra special bitter. Sometimes the Canadian versions are called English pale ales, which is also super confusing. So there you go. Okay, let's get back on track here. So there's 3 categories here: ordinary bitter, best bitter, and strong bitter, which is also called extra special bitter or ESB, but that's now trademarked by Fuller's. So be careful with that. Although, of course, we don't have rules here or British rules don't really apply in Canada. And so you've got places or breweries that call them an ESB, even though they're not really supposed to, blah, blah, blah. So basically the ABV goes up through the family, bitterness increases slightly, but not aggressively, and the color pretty much remains constant with sort of just a minor widening of the range because obviously there's going to be a bit more grain in them. So these beers, big surprise, are bitter forward. Nothing like the North American thermonuclear hop bombs, but they're bitter forward. And we're looking for sort of a dominant but not overwhelming hop aroma in these, usually earthy, floral, sometimes woody, sometimes a little bit minty, actually. There's often a little bit of fruitiness from the yeast, and the underlying malt's going to be bready, like a digestive biscuit or a Weetabix. And then there's a touch of caramel in almost all of these. It's just very, very slight. Moving on to golden ales. So they are kind of like a summer beer for those 3 hot days a year they get in England. They're sparkling and golden, as the name suggests. It's hop dominant and quite refreshing. Don't look for a lot of caramel here or anything. Just drink it cold and enjoy it, and that's what it is. So the English IPA is much different than its American cousin. There's more malt, a little less anger, The imported examples tend to be slightly oxidative, so the best bet is to get on a plane or find a scrupulous brewer who makes the style here, or find someone who's going to import it and not leave it on a warm shelf for 6 months. Floral Hall, by the way, and Bickford teamed up to make a superb example not that long ago. And actually, maybe I'll mention it to them again because I kind of missed that beer. The British brown ales are, again, much different than the American ones. So they're softer and a bit maltier and very hard to find. So the classic example here is Newcastle Brown, and the LCBO has sort of deemed it not worth importing, I guess, because I haven't seen it in years. The British brown is kind of like a porter without roast, if we want to say it that. Or maybe like say it sort of bridges the dark mild and porter. I think that's more accurate. So speaking of which, a porter and a stout and a porter and a stout porter. Okay, so I mean, it's a bit confusing, but a porter is like the baseline. It's dark brown. It's a bit roasty. It's a bit bitter. It usually has roasted malt characteristics like chocolate. And then the stouts are bigger porters, but then they vary and then the lines blur and then no one knows what's what. I guess an easy way to differentiate it is you just think about a stout as roastier and probably has more coffee notes from the malt. And then, so there's a variation. There's a bunch of sort of subcategories here when it comes to the stouts. So there's what used to be called a milk stout, because it has lactose in it. Now it's called the sweet stout because there's various restrictions. I guess it was promoted as a healthy, well, I don't guess it was promoted as a healthy beverage, because, the milk angle and as a tonic for what they called invalids at the time or whatever. So it might be why they had to drop the milk name, because people were getting hammered thinking that they were going to get better or something. So they can be a little bit sweet and have a creamier mouthfeel, as the name suggests. So the yeasts are unable to metabolize lactose, and therefore those residual sugars remain in place, lending it that sweetness. Oatmeal stouts are just that. There's oats that are thrown into the grist, gives it a slightly oily and smooth mouthfeel, but that's not like an off-putting thing, so don't think about it as, oily is it's true, but it's not a very good description. It's not a very pleasant description. And they tend to lean towards the roasty coffee side than the sweet stouts. Almost all stouts, by the way, will express some coffee and chocolate, but it just varies from sort of style to style and brewer to brewer. Old ales and strong ales are, those are the big sort of fireplace sippers, right? And the barley wine is the big gun. And the others tend to be sort of less macho than the barley wine, but like it's strong, chewy, malty. It's really complex, multifaceted. It's very high ABV. Often they're quite aged. And then you get a little bit of an oxidative vinous quality to them, but that's desired. And let's stick with the Isles. In fact, let's stick with the same Isle. So Scotland has its own sort of brewing traditions, and the Scottish ales tend to be underhopped, malty, caramelly, and low gravity. So kind of like the bitter family, there's a family of Scottish ales. They go from 60 shilling to 80 shilling, well, 60 shilling, 70 shilling, and 80 shilling. And then there's something called a wee heavy, which is a sort of a different beast. The 60 shilling is also called Scottish light. It's pretty hard to find, almost impossible to find. It seems to be relegated to cask service only, and it's very low in alcohol, like around 3%. And so the heavy, or the 70 shilling, is still pretty low in alcohol, but less low. And then the export, or the 80 shilling, is the stronger of the three. As we move up the ladder, the ABV increases, as I mentioned, but the IBUs go up a little bit too. The color lightens, which is strange, and the toffee and caramel characteristics will increase. The wee heavy is sometimes called a Scotch ale, and it's the biggest of them. It's up to 10% alcohol. It's chewy, malty. McEwen's, if you can ever find that, is a pretty good example. It's kind of like a more malt-forward, darker barley wine, but less complex. Does that make sense? It's almost like a bock, too, sometimes. Okay, so my guess here is that everyone knows what Guinness is. And along with Murphy's, it dominates the Irish stout world. Well, who are we kidding? Guinness dominates the Irish stout world regardless. But Murphy's, Beamish, and O'Hara are all excellent contenders. They're all slightly different, and it's worth trying them all. I like Guinness. I like Murphy's. They're all good. Anyways, Irish stout is basically a black, roasty, dry, big beer. But it's not that big, right? There's all these sort of illusions that it's filling and et cetera, but really it's low alcohol, it's low carbonation, it's low calorie, and that's sort of semi-consistent across that world. But it's interesting to know that there's a big range in bitterness with these beers, and also anything with nitrogen is going to round that off anyway. So Guinness is a little less sort of, roasty and or it feels less roasty and it feels less sharp than, say, Beamish or O'Hara. So the Irish Reds are kind of like a softer North American red. Again, we're going backwards because the North American red would have come from the Irish Red. But either way, this is not an origin story. It's a style overview. So there's a bit of caramel, a bit of toast, some medium bitterness, and it's a malt balanced beverage, but it's not super malty. So it's almost like a British bitter, but dial back the hops a little bit and increase the redness, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's go to Germany for zero geographic reasons, but I kind of feel like it. So, like everywhere, we have the pale, the less pale, the dark, and then the kind of funny ones. So let's start with the palest. So Munich Helles is the standard everyday drinking beer. It's malt focused, but the floral hops sort of balance it out. It's basically a lager. Well, it is a lager, but it's sort of bready and soft, if you want to call it that, and the basis for a lot of lagers. The German Pilsner, and keep in mind the profile, specifically the shortness, varies from north to south. It's more bitter and sharper in the north, and then a little softer in the south. And this is the most bitter sort of the German pales. It should have a hoppy nose. Again, floral, spicy, which is a stupid descriptor, but it's there nonetheless. Herbal. And the bready malt should be sort of secondary, but it's definitely there because this is not an IPA. This is a Pilsner. It's a balanced, semi-balanced beverage that's more bitter and hop forward. Leicht beer is basically, it's literally light beer. It's just lighter, sort of a lighter Helles. Export beer is the bridge between Helles and Pilsner, really. And by the way, we're not really supposed to call it Pilsner. It's supposed to call it Pils out of respect for Pilsen. But I might go back and forth because, these rules are very, very soft. Okay, let's look at the wheats. So there's what they call Weiss beers or Weizens. So the sort of standard Weiss beer, the Bavarian Weiss beer, it's got that bready malt to it, which of course comes from the yeast. But the big standout here is there's a big nose of banana and clove. The balance varies in between the two of them, but these are yeast products, and we'll get into that when we get to the style. The Dunkel Weiss is, well, it's darker, so the clove and banana are still there, but the bread is more crust or sort of deeper malt, if you want to call it that. And so the Weizenbock is just, bigger and stronger Dunkelweizen, really, which is a good segue into the box. So these bad boys are the big guns of the Deutschland. They are malt forward, higher in alcohol, and as they go up the ladder, all kinds of deeper flavors come out. So my Bock, or Hellesbock, is the lighter and the more bitter of them all. The Dunkelbock, or Urbock, which means original, is it's clean malt and alcohol. But deeper malt flavors, right? So we're looking, obviously for the Hellesbock, we're looking for, the lighter bread flavors. This is consistent through beer, by the way, is the darker they go up until you get really black. We're looking at bread of pretty much the same sort of color up the gradient, right? And so then the Doppelbocks are double bocks, and they're stronger versions of the two of them. And there's lighter Doppelbocks and darker Doppelbocks, and everything is bigger. And then the Eisbock is a Doppelbock that was frozen and then run off so that the alcohol is more concentrated. This is the fireplace beer. This is the barley wine, or the Scotch ale type of thing. This is not, you finish mowing the lawn, now you want to drink a 14% beer in your backyard. It should be served warm as well, but of course we'll get into that later. In the Rhine area, Köln, or Cologne, if you lean French, has a beer called Kulch. It is a lagered ale. It's refreshing. It often has a little bit of an appley nose, and in tasting exams, they try and trick you sometimes by throwing a cream ale in there or a Kulch and asking which one's which. I don't, this is weird. You shouldn't be able to get tricked by it, but I did, and so did everyone else, incidentally, at one exam, because it tasted like the tail end of a bag of Frito-Lays. I think it just was a freshness issue. I am sure that the exam administrators would disagree. It was terrible, and I don't know what to say. Anyways, I'm going off here. But anyways, if you hop on the train and go 20 minutes north, you'll end up in Dusseldorf, and the beer there is Altbier. It's also a lagered ale, but it's quite different. I don't know why they actually group these together. Well, I guess they do because they're so close geographically, but it's darker. The malt character is richer and toastier. It's around as bitter as a British bitter, incidentally. And a really good comparison actually is a California Common, which is just as hard to find now. So good luck with both. Okay, Fest beer is a kind of an amber color. It's brewed for fests, Quelle Surprise. It's a lager, so it's pretty clean fermentation. Again, it's a little bit toasty and does have some residual sweetness. And then the Märzen, which often gets confused with the Fest beer outside of Germany. It's more intense and toastier and a bit drier. I mean, they are similar, but the color is different. There's a lot of differences there. They're both sort of an amber orange, although I do find, actually, yeah, they're pretty interchangeable. They go back and forth, but it depends on who brewed it. Sticking with this color scheme, let's talk about Vienna lagers. So I know Vienna isn't in Germany, by the way, but they do speak German, so good enough. Also, it's the only beer from Austria that's in the guidelines, so we're just going to stick with this sort of theme of the area. Where was I? Okay, so it was developed around the same time as Märzen by a couple of pals. And so, again, it's amber to copper. It's toasty malt. It's got a pretty clean ferment. It's got some medium bitterness, and it should finish pretty dry. Just as an aside, there are some really awful attempts at this beer. And like every time I go to a brewery and they have a Vienna lager, I kind of, I shudder, but I order it anyways. And, quite frankly, I've had some pretty good experiences. So, but if you go to the store and buy some, there's some that are just like, they have no business being in a can. Okay, moving on. Munich Dunkel, it's the darker version of the Helles, really. That's not very accurate, but it's a good way to just look at it from like a bird's eye view. The Helles means pale and Dunkel means dark, if you haven't already concluded that. So it's more crusty bread and more malty, of course, than the Helles, but the hopping and the fermentation are still fairly the same, as in basically unpresent. Rauch beers are smoked. In most cases, it's a Märzen that's been brewed with malt that has then been smoked over beechwood. The malt has been smoked over beechwood and then the beer has been brewed with it, just to be clear. So just think about a smoky Märzen, but it's not even just smoke. Anyways, we'll get into it when we do that style, but it's a very complex beer, and the first time you drink one, you're going to probably not like it. I don't want to put words in your mouth or thoughts in your brain, but it's something you need to get accustomed to. How about that? Schwarzbier is literally black beer. It's a little bit of a cerebral short circuit. So because it's black, you kind of, it's not even black, it's actually brown, but you kind of want to think it's going to be a porter, but then it's not. And so I guess a really easy way to describe it, if you'd never had one, is it's like a tame porter with a very smooth foundation. I don't know if that's a really good way to describe it, but it lacks any of the roughness of a porter. And then the finish is sort of glassy smooth. Again, we'll get deeper into it later on or at some other point. Okay, so did we talk about German sours? I don't think we did. Okay, so the Gosa is sort of the love child of Goslar and adopted by Leipzig. And it is a refreshing sour ale. It's kind of got a lactic sourness that it has coriander and salt added. It's pretty light. It's refreshing. And it's not the rip your face off kind of sourness that American kettle sours have, or any just lactic sours. Berliner Weiss is another light sour. It's kind of like a bready beer with some tartness. It's very highly carbonated, and it's often served now with fruit syrup, or Woodruff syrup. I think it's raspberry and Woodruff are the two main syrups. Okay, so that does it for Germany. Czechia seems to be the next logical step. So the BJCP will categorize 4 of these because it's just a flyby. I'm not going to bother dissecting pale versus premium pale. These are the Pilsners, the original Pilsners. And the most accurate use of the term balance in European beer, I think, applies to these because they are malt forward, but they're also hop forward, but they're also bitterness forward. But they're also, some fermentation characteristic forward, despite the fact that they're lagered. So often there's this buttery diacetyl that's pretty standard, and it's very obvious too. Like if you're trying to calibrate for diacetyl and you can't find an off flavor, and it's not an off flavor in these, but it is in other things, just get a Pilsner Urquell, especially one that's been lying around. If you're in Ontario, the LCBO treats their beer very badly. So you'll get some nice diacetyl in a Pilsner Urquell that's been sitting on the shelf for months. Okay, so the amber lager is more amber, of course, and with all the accoutrement that comes with such color. So more caramel, a little bit of Maillard, and then there's the dark lager is going to bring more of those darker characteristics into play. Some can be roastier, some could be more molassesy. A lot of versions are quite terrible. That's my opinion. And with that, we will finish with that part of Europe and move over to Belgium. So Belgian beers mostly have a unifying characteristic, and that is very expressive yeast. The Belgian blonde, if you think Leffe, is a phenolic and estery, kind of spicy, but not heat spice, of course. Pretty dry, pretty high carbonation, and quite Belgian. The Belgian Pale Ale, which is typified by palm, and it's hard to find, outside of Belgium, but it's the most boring of them all. It's got a pretty decent fruity estery bouquet, but it's like the most middle of the road and was really made just to compete with boring imports. The Wit beer is a wheat beer, although it means white, but it doesn't matter. It's a wheat beer. Hoegaarden is the poster child here. It's pale, hazy, yeasty, for lack of a better word, of which there are many. So maybe I should have used them. But anyways, it's bitter orange or curacao, if you want to be precise, and coriander are added into this brew. And so you should look for a bit of a citrusy and spicy note on the nose. And then it's kind of bready in the mouth. I mean, you've all had it. So that's something to think about there. The Golden Strong, it's one of the bigger guns. So it's higher in alcohol, higher in carbonation, and it's got a really fruity bouquet. Duvel or Delirium Tremens are the major players here. The names of most of these beers refer to the devil in some way, which is what Duvel means. Another category is the monastic Trappist or abbey beers, which are traditionally brewed by monks, but now it's mostly done secularly, but under supervision at the monastery. So Trappist, by the way, is a designation. So if you're not Trappist certified, then it's an abbey beer, or I guess you could call it a monastic beer. So for competitions, we just define them as monastic beers because 99% of home brewers are not going to be Trappist certified. Okay, so there's 4 categories here. And I think I should point out that Belgian beers don't really fall victim to the same kind of categorization as we do. And so they have blondes and browns and ambers, but they don't really have, like specific names and specific categories for the most part. So a lot of this was pushed on them. Anyways, within this category, there is a single, or also called a Patersbier. There's a double, a triple, and a quadruple, also called a dark strong. So this is where it gets kind of confusing. So none of them are really the same thing. So it does seem like it should be like the Scottish ales or the British ales, just based on that nomenclature. Or like IPAs with like a double and a triple, but it's not. So the single is a pale, bitter, hoppy, dry, and highly carbonated, low alcohol beer. So it's generally a table beer reserved for the monks. Then the double I should say, is a malty, dark, 6 to 7% alcohol beer with lots of dark fruit, deep character, sometimes a little bit of chocolate there. Then moving to the triple, we're going back to pale again. So it's a high carbonated, sort of peppery phenolic with some fruity esters. It's like a Golden Strong, but it's shifted more towards the phenolics than the esters, which is a good way to think about that. It's 7 to 9%-ish. And then going to the quad or the dark strong, we go back to dark again. So it's kind of like a double of a double or a double. Anyway, so it's got lots of dark fruit and chocolate and toffee and alcohol and depth and complexity and whatnot. And I guess if you really wanted to, you could say a triple is a double single and a quadruple is a double double. That's not quite true, but it's a very sort of rudimentary or elementary maybe way of looking at it. And I don't think that's the worst idea just to get to know these, but obviously that's something you need to throw out the window as you go down the road. Okay, so now let's move into the farmhouse ales. The farmhouse is a very loose category. And for this purpose, we're talking about Saison and Bière de Garde. There are a lot of other farmhouse type beers. And because we're working just with the BJCP here, at least their guidelines, otherwise this episode would never end. Seriously, I'd be I'd be dead when I'm still talking, which might be the case. But anyways, it is. Let's just stick with these two. So saison is dry, it's carbonated, and it's pretty phenolic. It's a little bit fruity, a little bit funky. It's also not one thing either. So there are dark saison, light saisons. There are low and high ABV versions like table saisons and special saisons, and they all really hail from Wallonia, which is the French-speaking part of Belgium. Saison Dupont will set sort of the standard, even though there isn't one. But I mean, if you can only get one saison, that's probably the one, and that's how you can calibrate. Bière de Garde is a French provision beer, so it means for keeping, and it's a bit stronger and maltier, like a Bock. There are blonde, dark, and amber versions once again, and again, it's a huge category without many constraints. It's often grouped with saison for reasons beyond any sensory logic because they are two completely different beers. The only thing is they were farmhouse provision, so you kind of drink, if you could get both, let's just say, like the idea would be you'd be drinking saison while you're out in the field working, which doesn't seem very safe, and then you drink Bière de Garde like in the winter while you were inside, canning stuff, let's just say. Belgian sours are another sort of category here. This is really where complexity meets complexity. The lambics are spontaneous fermentation, so they're inoculated with yeast and organisms that are living in the air, right? So they ferment them in these cool ships, these big open fermenters, and they just get wild yeast. Sometimes they add fruit for a secondary fermentation, which makes it a fruit lambic. The blended versions, which are usually sort of different vintages, are called we're going to talk about this more down the road, and I don't want to be one of those guys who says karate. The Dutch pronunciation would be geuze. The Flemish would be a little bit softer than that. It's perfectly fine to say geuse, which is the French, or you can say whatever you like because this is not language, school here. They are all sour, funky, and very interesting and extremely complex. And these are beers that you need to spend a lot of time with. They're all going to be different each time. There's very little homogeneity here. They're really a wonderful treat if you can find them, and they are worth the price as you go down your sort of beer journey road. The Flanders sours are split between East and West, like hip hop. So the reds are kind of oaky, balsamic-y, and fruity. You can kind of think about cherries or something. And then the Oud Browns are they're categorized in the same, but they're completely different. So they're more malty, more caramelly. They taste kind of old, but in a good way. They're sort of vinous almost. There's a bit of leather and stuff in there, and they are not aged in oak, so there's no oak character there. Okay, so over to America we go. We all know what light and American lagers are, right? Bud Light, Bud, etc. I don't think I need to really talk about those. So moving a little higher up the ladder. So the more complex, easy beers, if we want to call them that, are wheat beers and cream ales. The cream of wheat, yep. So cream ale is described as clean and drinkable. It's usually made out of 6-row with some corn, and you have to have it pretty cold, otherwise it starts to taste like cabbage. So there are some okay ones, but like it's kind of like an American lager with a bit more personality, but not much. The American wheat is a breadier kind of beer. It's pretty refreshing, and there shouldn't be any yeast character with this because it's not European. So it's the American version, and they're just using a cleaner yeast basically. And the next step up is blonde ale. So a really good one will have sort of a feather's edge of bitterness below the malt. It should have a slightly understated tartness and then maybe some citrus on the nose and maybe even a touch of resin, like a touch. But a bad one is going to taste more like a cream ale, and they are, there's some bad versions of this too. I think it's just kind of hard to make. So it's sort of the transition beer from lawnmower to craft. It's also just often used as a faster lager, right? Because you don't have to lager it. So it's kind of like an alternative to lager for the brewery with faster production. But again, like there's definitely good versions out there, but there are some pretty awful ones too. So pale ale is nowadays usually just a smaller IPA, but it's the Americanized version of the British pales. So it's mid-level ABV, or standard level, I guess I should say. Everything now is like 6 or 7% in the IPA world. So it's like, it's going to be lower than that, 4.5 to 5. It's hop forward, and it's going to have grainy malt underneath those hops. The IPA is obviously bigger, so it's got bigger, hoppier, and there's multiple variations. I'll just touch on these. So the West Coast is more pine and resin. The East, or any IPA or hazy IPA, juicy IPA, is going to be more tropical, a little less bitter, and it's, of course, usually hazier. We can get into that later or down the road. Brut IPAs are more dried out. And more effervescent. Red IPAs are kind of like a red ale with an attitude problem. Black IPAs are like a Schwarzbier that's been IPA'd. White IPAs are like a Belgian Vit with IPA, like a hybrid. Belgian IPAs are like an IPA with big yeast character. Brown IPAs are like aggressive brown ales, really, and kind of the list goes on and on. Double IPAs are double, so they're more bitter, more alcohol, and a bigger grain bill, so more of everything, really. We're getting really good at brewing those as a brewing society, and so double IPAs are really quite wonderful. Triple IPAs are even more, and they can be pretty bad. They can also be pretty good, but for the most part, it's really hard to get them right, and I'm sure we'll get there in the future, and then everyone's going to be running around drinking 9% beers all day long. American Amber Ale is a more caramel forward, bigger bodied, and darker pale ale. It's got less bitterness, and a little more sweetness, and as I said, the body's a bit bigger because it's slightly more under attenuated than the pale ale. The California Common, which is also that sort of amber color, is also called the steam beer. It's very hard to find. It is kind of like a Märzen a little bit, or a Vienna Lager maybe. It's toasty, it's caramelly. It's got good bitterness, which is pretty firm. It's got a decent hop presence, and Northern Brewer hops, which are quite woody, define the hop character in this beer. American brown ales are more aggressive than the British, still malty, but with more hop presence and more bitterness. American porter and stout are more aggressive than the British. Big surprise again. More roasty, more bitter. Imperial stout is bigger and more complex with more alcohol presence, and often dark dried fruit and a bit of a chocolate quality, or a bit more chocolate quality, I guess I should say. And then staying on the strength thread, we've got American barley wines, and they're everything. They're malty, hoppy, bitter, alcohol-y, chewy, complex, fruity. It's just a super amped up version of the British one, with more focus on the hops. And you can see it's a common theme with most of these beers is that the American versions are just going to be angrier and more aggressive than the British. Wheat wine is similar to barley wine, but there's a bit of a wheat sharpness there, and there are more complexities that we will deal with down the road. Okay, so hopefully I didn't forget anyone, but we'll get to them in the future if we did. I wanted this, of course, to serve as a brief overview. I don't know how brief. Oh, God, it's not that brief. Anyways, as brief an overview as possible before we go style by style, which is going to take a long time. And so just to wrap up, British beers, mostly herbal and woody hop-wise, the fruity yeast character, and less in-your-face face-wise. Americans are hoppy, aggressive, and in-your-face. The Germans and Czechs are cleaner with a focus on the noble hops and with a lot of lagering going on, and the Belgians are yeasty, complex, and unruly. Until next time, stay thirsty and stay curious.